Back on the Gallo Show, SuperTalk Mississippi, live from the Trustmark Bank Studios. And in the studio with us now, we've got our friend Jay Robertson. He's the Director of Employability and Criminal Justice Reform with Empower Mississippi. Good morning, Jay. Thanks for coming on.
Good morning. Thank you for having me on today.
So, full disclosure, I serve as the chairman of the board of Empower Mississippi. No secret about that. Have been involved with the organization since 2014 when it was formed, and happy to serve in that capacity, and very passionate about our mission and those policies which we advocate, which include school and education choice and also criminal justice reform, with the objective, as we say, of breaking down barriers to allow Mississippians to flourish. So, a lot of talk about criminal justice reform, not certainly in our state, but across the country right now. And there are some bills that are traversing through the Capitol related to criminal justice reform. Tell us a little bit about what's going on there.
Absolutely, yeah. And if we can step back and remember, before we were facing this coronavirus pandemic, we were facing another crisis in this state, and it's a crisis in our Mississippi prison system. There were a rash of deaths and violence in state prisons. The news just said that another individual was found dead in Mississippi prisons yesterday. That brings the number up to 47 people that have died in state prisons since the end of December.
Since the end of December.
That's
so
right.
Less than 6 months.
That's right. And we all understand that prison is can be a dangerous place and a violent place, but that number of deaths is just outside the pale, even for prisons. And so that led to a Department of Justice investigation. They announced that they were investigating conditions in state prisons. And so that really increases the urgency for Mississippi to take a hard look at what we're doing with our state prisons. And there's a lot of factors that play into that sort of violence, but what those all boil down to is the fact that we as a state incarcerate way too many people per capita. We have the second highest incarceration rate in the country. If we were an industrialized country, Mississippi would have more people in prison.
Excuse me, Jay. Tell us, how's that calculated, the incarceration rate? What's the math there?
Sure, it's a per capita basis.
Okay.
So you look at the number of people that we have in prison per 100,000.
Okay.
And so for a state our size to have 18,000 people in prison, that's more than all but one other state in the country. And so,
wow.
I don't think it's because Mississippians are more criminal than other people.
Right.
It's because a lot of these laws that are outdated that apply really long, harsh sentences to conduct that is sometimes relatively minor and even nonviolent.
Yeah.
And so what these bills that are moving through the legislature now would do is give the state the opportunity to take a second look at a lot of these sentences to say people should have the ability to earn some sort of release if they are no longer a public safety risk, and they can be considered with a psychiatric evaluation. Let the parole board take a look at some of these long, harsh sentences. In Mississippi, someone can get a life sentence for something as minor as marijuana possession.
Life sentence?
Absolutely. And that's because,
just for possession?
Absolutely. And
so we go lock these people up, spend a whole bunch of money for possession.
That's right. And so that's one of the reasons I think you see so many conservatives interested in this issue, because it's a huge financial drain on our state. We spend $18,000 a year to incarcerate somebody in the state. That's almost double what we spend to educate a child in this state. And so when you look at that math, it's pretty easy to say for every person you can not incarcerate who maybe doesn't need to be there, that's money you can apply directly back into education or things that are more effective at actually promoting public safety than just keeping people in prison who don't need to be there.
Yeah.
And that's the reason these bills are so important. And there's a lot of interest in them in the legislature right now. You've got a couple of big parole bills, House Bill 1377 and Senate Bill 2123, that look to address this very, very issue.
And what exactly would those bills do? What changes would they make?
Sure. So in Mississippi, we used to allow parole pretty broadly. The parole board could look at somebody and say, this person has made a really good effort to change their life while they're incarcerated. We're going to choose to let them out. Well, over the past probably 20 years, that was undone in the 90s through this kind of tough on crime approach that kind of, went through the country. And what we found, though, is that that is not an effective way to run a prison system. And you can talk to anybody in the Department of Corrections, and they'll tell you that. That's what leads to these outbreaks of violence that we've had. When you put someone in prison and you say you're going to serve 10 years, and it doesn't matter if you are a model inmate who chooses to run a Bible study and learn a trade skill and improve your life, or if you're the worst guy in the building, you're going to serve 10 years regardless. And so people respond to incentives, and that sort of incentive structure makes it really difficult to encourage people to behave while they're incarcerated. So the idea behind these bills is it would allow people to earn a portion of their sentence, or earn a reduction in a portion of their sentence if they choose to participate in rehabilitative programming, earn a job skill, and try to change their life. And they could be considered by the parole board to earn that time off their sentence.
So isn't it true, Jay, with respect to a nonviolent crime such as marijuana possession or I guess just use of drugs in general, that how does just locking these people up, how does that really benefit them or society?
Sure.
And spending a lot of money on it, too.
Sure. And I think what we like to think, I think what a lot of people used to think when we promoted some of these laws were that if we lock somebody up, at least they'll get clean. They won't be able to use, they'll kick their habit and they come out better. Well, I've got news for you if you haven't learned. Drugs are rampant in prison.
They absolutely are.
Drugs are more readily available in prison than anywhere else. And so what you have in a lot of instances, unfortunately, is people who get locked up for a nonviolent drug offense continue to use and sometimes come out worse than they went in. And that's what leads to this revolving door of recidivism where people go back to prison, and it makes us less safe. And so there's a better way to do this, and that's the reason that you see conservatives like President Trump and, promoting criminal justice reform, because they realize not only does it help us financially, allow us to invest our tax dollars in places that provide a better return, it makes us more safe by promoting solutions that actually address the underlying issue, which go unaddressed in prisons too often.
And so there are also challenges with the mandatory minimums as well, correct? So explain how that works and what the situation is there.
That's right. So the biggest mandatory minimum that Mississippi has is what's sometimes referred to as our three strikes law. And so that means if you have two previous offenses, even if they were relatively minor, and they could all be drug offenses, you can receive a severe mandatory sentence. Sometimes you can receive a life sentence, even if your current offense was not a crime of violence. There are people currently serving life sentences in state prison for marijuana offenses, like I mentioned, because of this three strikes law. The problem with Mississippi's three strikes law specifically is that it's overly broad. That's not a wise use of our tax dollars to spend $18,000 a year to lock someone up for a nonviolent drug offense. And so there's an important bill moving right now, House Bill 1024, that would work to start scaling that back, to say we're not going to spend tax dollars to put someone in prison for life for a nonviolent offense. And so the reason I think you see the legislature looking at this is because it's been pioneered by other southern conservative states in a lot of cases. We're not reinventing the wheel here. We're not asking Mississippi to do something that hasn't been tried out before. These are things that have been pioneered by Rick Perry as governor of Texas. By Governor Nathan Deal, governor of Georgia, and by President Trump with the First Step Act in Washington.
Well, we spend a lot of money locking people up, and then we let them out, and they're not any better. And so what do we achieve? I think that's the question. What do we achieve for the taxpayers? What do we achieve for society? What did we achieve, more importantly, for the individual? There are certainly better ways of handling that. One of the questions we had, Jay, on the C Spire text line from Darren in Jackson is, what's the definition of nonviolent?
Sure. So Mississippi has made some progress on criminal justice reform in recent years, and one of the big first things that we did in 2014 was the legislature passed a bill to, for the first time, codify what is a crime of violence in Mississippi. And so a crime of violence is defined in state law. It's basically anything that is an act of violence on another person, what you would think of as assault, murder, rape, those type of things. Anything that's not classified there is a nonviolent offense. Okay. And there's a lot of those that can trigger long sentences because of these mandatory minimums.
Gotcha. We'll talk some more if you can hang with us after the break.
Absolutely.
We've got Jay Robertson from Empower, Mississippi. We're talking about criminal justice reform. Stay with us on The Gallo Show from the Trustmark Studios. Back with you on The Gallo Show from the Trustmark Studios, SuperTalk, Mississippi. Duran bringing us in there, Perez. Appreciate that. So, Jay, one final question about the nonviolent definition. This again from Darren and Jackson. Is burglary a nonviolent offense? How's that codified?
So the way that the law is structured right now, it can be determined by a judge, but if there's someone inside the house, burglary is considered a violent offense. Gotcha.
So, little different treatment and approach with respect to incarceration and imprisonment when a burglary is committed. So generally, though, when we think about nonviolent offenses, mostly drug offenses. Is that fair to say?
That's right. And, the important piece of the bills that are moving through the legislature right now acknowledge that there is a difference in crimes that are crimes of violence versus nonviolence.
Yeah.
And so all the bills stick with this framework that was set up by the state in 2014 when they passed the first big bill that I mentioned, codified what is a crime of violence versus not violence.
Yeah.
And the standard that established was, it said that although you can earn time off your sentence, you have to serve a minimum of at least half your sentence if you're convicted of a crime of violence. And you've got to serve at least 25% for a nonviolent offense. And so the problem is that's not always applied equally, and it hasn't been applied equally over the years. And so you've got this odd situation where people convicted of similar offenses might be eligible to earn time off or not. And it creates just a really difficult environment for our prison officials. And so these bills recognize that, and they apply that standard across the board to say that we're going to have certainty in sentencing. When someone gets sentenced to an offense, we need to have certainty that they're going to be sentenced swiftly and that sentence will be fair and carried out the right way.
What about the concept, Jay, of compassionate release to individuals? Explain that for our listeners, what that is and kind of what the thoughts are there.
Yeah, so Mississippi has a statute for compassionate release. That's when you've got a lot of these people who are incarcerated are a lot older. They've been there for years, and many of them, they do the same thing everyone else does as they get old. They require a lot of medical attention.
Yeah.
And when you're in a state prison, our state bears 100% of the burden of paying for those medical expenses.
Yep.
And so you've got a unit that looks pretty much like a nursing home in Parchman, where you have folks who are on dialysis and are requiring these hugely expensive treatments. And it's only a small number of people we're talking about who fall into that category, but they cost an enormous amount of money for the state budget.
Sure.
Whereas what a lot of states have chosen to do is that if someone is nearing end of life like that, they have the option of granting compassionate release from a facility and sentencing them to home confinement. So they're still serving their sentence. They're not going to, if they get better, they're going back to prison. But the idea is that it relieves some of the financial burden on the state so that we can prioritize that money towards solutions that are more effective.
So I think that, correct me if I'm wrong here, the first criminal justice reform bill, I guess we could refer to that, was passed 15? Is that right?
2014 was House Bill 585. That was the first big one that Mississippi passed, and that was under Phil Bryant, and it was modeled on what Rick Perry had done in Texas.
And Phil and Rick, close friends. In fact, at my suite up in Oxford, had both of them in there for a game. He was entertaining Rick, and that's kind of cool. But we keep working on this. What's the attitude from, in your view, from the legislature these days with respect to criminal justice reform? How do they feel about that?
Sure. Well, I think they're looking at the fact that the Department of Justice has announced that they've opened an investigation into state prisons, and we can see how that's played out in other places. The same thing happened in Alabama, our neighboring state, when they had a rash of violence in prisons. DOJ opened an investigation, spent months looking at conditions, and they told the Alabama legislature that, one, you're going to need to pass some serious criminal justice reforms that help people earn time off their sentence who don't need to be there to relieve some of the pressure on the system. And two, you're going to have to spend about $1 billion to bring your prisons up to federal standards. And last time I checked, Mississippi doesn't have $1 billion sitting around to spend on new prisons. And so in a lot of ways, it's very urgent that we consider these bills now to make a good faith effort towards trying to improve the situation in our prisons so that we don't end up at the looking down the barrel of that gun from the federal investigation at the Department of Justice. And I think that's something that a lot of policymakers are concerned about, and that's another reason you see interest in continuing this process of criminal justice reform.
Yeah, and this really kind of came to the forefront. I can't remember the lady's name, but I believe from Alabama, right, who was incarcerated involving in a text exchange to help facilitate a drug deal and was locked up, and the president acquitted her, essentially, and allowed her out, granted clemency. Her name escapes me right now, but she's become sort of a face for the criminal justice reform movement.
Yeah, Alice Johnson
Alice
might
Johnson,
be the person
right.
you're thinking
It
of.
is, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jay.
President Trump's taken a real interest in this because he recognizes that second chances are a real thing, and people can turn their lives around, and too often the law doesn't recognize that. And so if you've got a mandatory minimum sentence, even if you're like Miss Johnson, who is a grandmother and is, happy to be back with her family and is a model member of her community now, if it weren't for their actions, the actions of President Trump, she could still be incarcerated today.
Yeah, it's crazy. And spent a lot of money for really just a dumb reason, and had the opportunity to hear her share her story live at an event I attended a couple of years ago, and was just so touched by that. But it really just sort of brought it all into perspective, listening to her story, how upside down some of this stuff is. But there's clearly a movement, I think, Jay, across the country to reform some of these really just ancient embedded laws we have to a great extent. It's not only a cost problem from an economic perspective, but just a human toll.
I think that's right. And, what we're talking about here, just to be very clear, these are not the kind of movements you see in places like Seattle where they're looking to undo defund the police.
Different matter.
Yeah, this is something that's being led by conservatives.
Yeah.
And, like I said, it starts with President Trump at the top. But you've got states like Tennessee where Governor Bill Lee, a guy from the private sector, Republican, who came into office with a very aggressive criminal justice reform agenda. Because from his perspective, he sees that, Tennessee and Mississippi, states like us, don't have unlimited funds to spend, and we need to get the best return on our tax dollars that we can. And there are solutions that are better at improving public safety than just longer prison sentences and building more prisons.
No question about it. I shared with you on the break that I spent some time 20 years ago working on an IT project for the New Jersey Department of Corrections. There's 16 institutions up there and a little over 43,000 incarcerated. But I got curious at just how much money was being spent and did some research and found that they were spending more per offender that they had locked up than the United States military spends to house our sailors on our finest sailing vessels. It's just incredible when you think about that contrast and that comparison. That's sort of upside down. I can tell you something else to your point about the health care and the medical treatment. It is enormously expensive. And the New Jersey Department of Corrections had 700 medical staff that worked for the Department of Corrections, taking care of the offenders. And we implemented one of the first electronic health record systems in the United States back in 1998-99 time frame in the New Jersey Department of Corrections.
Wow.
It's bigger than most hospitals.
Sure.
And it costs a ton of money. And it really doesn't make any sense. It's not the best sort of approach and environment to doing that. So it's a deeper and wider discussion than just going to court, being sentenced, carrying them off to prison, serve your sentence, you get out, and you're naturally just a model citizen and back productive in society. It doesn't work that way.
That's right. And, so much of this conversation, I think we missed the point that everyone's goal for the criminal justice system is to protect public safety.
Sure.
That's what it exists for. And we're not talking about whether people should be arrested for this or that. We're talking about what happens after that person is arrested. How are they treated? How are they sentenced? And what happens next? And the reality that I think a lot of people miss is that 95% of the people who are currently in Mississippi prisons will be released at some point.
Okay.
So the vast majority of those people are going to be coming back into our communities at some point. The question is, what are we going to do to ensure that when they do, they are better equipped to live a productive life than when they went in there?
Yeah.
And the current environment just doesn't make that easy. Part of the problem is, you mentioned correctional officers. Our Mississippi Department of Corrections is just overwhelmed.
Overwhelmed, underpaid, and it's difficult to make that work, honestly. And it is, as we said, it's kind of a hot mess. And, the governor, my heart and sympathy goes out to him a little bit. I shouldn't say sympathy, but concern, shall we say. He takes office, he's got this correctional problem, then he's got floods, then he's got tornadoes, then he's got pandemics and all this other stuff going on. But we got to keep the eye on the ball and get criminal justice reform through and keep working hard on that. Appreciate your work, Jay. Appreciate you coming on. Thanks for your insight.
Thank you.